Welcome, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and read a quick notice to the public. Due to the evolving situation with COVID-19 novel coronavirus, so long as state or local public officials have imposed or recommended social distancing measures, Vallecitos Water District will hold future meetings via teleconferencing and allow members of the public to observe and address the meeting telephonically or otherwise electronically. During this period of time, Vallecitos Water District will not be making any physical location available for members of the public to observe the meeting and offer public comment. The public is encouraged to watch and participate in the meeting from the safety of their homes. The meeting can be viewed on the agenda page located on the main page of the district's website. Public comments or questions can be submitted to the following email address: publiccomment@vwd.org. All written comments that are received 90 minutes before the meeting will be provided to the committee members, and a record of the receipt of comment will be noted during the meeting. Members of the public viewing the meeting via the Zoom video conferencing platform can express their desire to provide input at the appropriate time by utilizing the raised hand function. Additional instructions for online participation will be posted on the district's website at www.vwd.org/meetings.
And Director Sinai, no public comments have been received prior to the meetings. No written comments.
Okay, so called us to order, and since
we do have a raised hand though. Sorry.
Okay. Yes, we do. Thank you. Gail Martin has raised her hand. Would you like me to allow her to participate?
Yes, please.
Yep. Ms. Martin, I believe you can unmute and talk.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Dear Finance Committee members, our overhead rates and the supporting calculations should have been made available for public review along with the agenda. Due to the errors in calculating the developer fees, I am not confident that these rates assessed to developers are correct or fair. Also, a draft recommended reserve policy should have been ready for the public review and for this committee to review for their discussion and perhaps recommendation to the full board. Our current water rate provides for an annual transfer to capital reserves of $6.9 million, which is 14.5% of our current water rates. Our reserves are already overfunded. Our water rates need to be immediately reduced 13.5%, plus reduced by an additional amount to reimburse for those dollars already over collected. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Ms. Martin. Any other speakers, James?
None at this time.
Thank you. Then we'll go ahead and start off with item number 1, audit.
Sure. So as the Finance Committee is aware, I believe Wes will be presenting, or at least leading the presentations for probably all the items. So with that, Wes, I'll let you take it over.
Thank you, James. Good afternoon. I actually get the pleasure to pass this one on to Shannon Ayala, our partner on our audit. But just to introduce that, we are beginning our audit for fiscal year 2021. And we'd actually had interim audit, I believe it was last week. Was it a week ago? So they've started doing their interim testing and procedures. And Shannon's going to do sort of a kickoff to the audit by going over what they do for interim procedures, as well as the plan for the fieldwork procedures, which will be done in September. So with that, Shannon, take it away.
Thank you. So I will share my screen. I have put together a little presentation that I can share with you. Let me move this around a little so I can start my slideshow. Okay. Thank you, Wes. As he mentioned, we started the interim procedures last week. My agenda for today is to go over the SAS 114 planning letter. the interim field work, and then the final field work. So the SAS 114 planning letter is our requirement to have two-way communication with the committee about fraud and fraud risk, and also communicates modifications to our approach. I believe that you may have received this letter prior to the meeting. If not, let me know and I can share my screen with you and go over the letter. Basically,
Shannon, we have not.
no. Okay, let me do this. So this is the letter. Can you see this PDF, or do I need to stop sharing and reshare?
All we see is the presentation. At this point.
Okay. Sometimes when I switch between PDF and presentation, it doesn't go. So let me get back to go to the PDF. Now, can you see this?
Yeah, we can see the letter.
Okay. Are you all able to read it, or would you like me to read it to you? It's a standard letter that we send every year. And it basically communicates the timing of the audit, and then also allows for if the committee has any concerns regarding known or suspected instances of employee fraud, areas in which the internal controls of the district are thought to be weak by the board, any known or suspected misstatements in accounting records, any known or suspected use of improper accounting practices by the district, if you're aware of any pressure upon the district or management with respect to achieving certain financial results, if there are any matters that you have that warrant particular attention during the audit, or information about unusual transactions other than matters relevant to the audit. This allows for you at the end of the letter, has my phone number and email address, in which if you are having any concerns, you can reach out to me directly. So as Wes mentioned, we did the interim procedures about a week ago, and then we're going to do our final audit examination in September. And then we plan to finalize the comprehensive annual financial report in November. And we will present to the finance committee and board once the audit is complete. So in addition to our standard audit approach, we're going to continue to discuss with management the continued impact of COVID-19. And then this year, for our unpredictability test, we will be reviewing vendor contracts. So we will select the 5 largest vendor contracts and test them for compliance with district policies and procedures. Again, maybe Wes, after the meeting, if you could send this letter out to the finance committee or the whole board, then if anyone has any specific concerns, they can contact me directly. And let me go back to sharing the presentation. And sorry. Okay.
Shannon?
Yes, ma'am.
So I noticed that letter was dated June the 16th. What is the typical procedure? It seems like it should have been forwarded to us before now, since it was dated.
Yes, sorry. I actually did send it to Wes last week, I believe, or maybe it was the 16th. I would have to look at the email. And usually he forwards it to the committee before the meeting, but it looks like that wasn't done.
And is there a deadline? Having just looked at it when it was on the screen, I didn't register everything that it's asking, but if we had concerns, is there a deadline by which we need to submit those to you?
We normally say within 45 days, but it's not a hard deadline. So if someone were to email me after, pretty much up until the finalization of the audit, we could address concerns.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll go ahead and make sure that everybody on the board gets a copy of the letter probably by tomorrow.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so I went over all of this with the letter. And then during our interim field work, we updated the internal control narratives. We performed some fraud inquiries of staff within the district. We also worked on the unpredictability test. I'm not quite sure if it's complete at this time. If not, we will finish up that testing during final field work. We also did investment compliance and tested some disbursements. And at this point, I don't have anything to report on any of those items. And then during our final field work, we have our standard procedures, which include some receivable testing. We will do some capital asset testing, which involves testing construction in progress and ensuring that completed projects are capitalized when they are done. We will do pension and OPEB, other post-employment benefit journal entry review, to ensure those transactions are recorded correctly. And then we will do revenue and expense analysis. And with that being said, I will answer any other questions that the committee has.
Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you.
Director Boyd Hodgson, do you have any other questions or comments at this time?
Shannon, and maybe you can't answer this, but maybe you can give me just sort of a general idea.
Sure.
What percentage of your clients ever have a fraud that you detect?
Well, the detection of fraud related to a financial audit is very low. I think it's in the 1 to 2%. And our firm has detected fraud at clients, but it is probably in that 1 to 2% range due to materiality and other factors, being that we don't look at every single transaction of the district. So most of the times, I think the highest detection of fraud is employee whistleblowing or noting. And so that is why we do fraud inquiries with the staff and ask the finance committee if there are any concerns. And then we randomly select employees to provide those fraud questionnaires to.
And is this audit something that we are required to do by law, or is it a transparency?
It's required. It's for transparency. Financial audit of the district is required by California government code.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
And also, just for some more background, Director Boyd Hodgson, in addition to the audit standards that Shannon just kind of outlined as to what her and her team are going to be reviewing at the district, we've always, as part of this process, I wouldn't say we've done it every year, but we definitely have exercised this in the past, where if there's something that the committee or if the full board brings something up, they certainly could as well, but it's always been done at the committee level, that we want to have the auditor kind of scratch the surface a little deeper. We have that option here. So if you obviously, you might not have something top of mind, but if you think of something over the coming days or weeks that you'd like to have them scratch the surface a little deeper, that's certainly part of our scope of work with them. And to give you an example, a few years back, before we had BBK, the finance committee asked the auditor at the time, I don't think it was David Spar, I think it was a previous auditor, to kind of dig a little deeper into our contract with our legal services. And while there was no fraud or anything bad like that found, one of the things that came out of it is that it was pointed out that legal contract had not been competed for over 30 years. And the committee, then the full board, after the committee brought it to the full board, discussed it. We didn't think that was a good practice, and we created an ordinance that basically requires the district now to compete any contract, I believe over $100,000. It requires the district to compete a contract that's valued over $100,000 spend at least once every 5 years. And so this was probably 4 or 5 years ago. So don't totally hold me to the numbers. I don't know, James, if you remember that exactly, but that was I think one of the good things that kind of came out of the audit that wasn't part of the standard, the auditing standards that they look at.
Okay,
Yes,
thank you.
agreed.
That's helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
If there are no other questions, I can drop off the meeting.
Okay, thank you, Shannon.
Okay,
Thank you,
thank
Shannon.
you.
Hey, Shannon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. Moving right along, item number 2, overhead rates.
Go ahead, Wes, go and take it away. And Director Snell, it was, I believe, 2017 when we did that, when we were looking at those contracts in 2018 when we got BBK on board.
Yep.
Okay, so I do want to apologize. I did find that email from Shannon with the SAS letter in my email, and I usually forward it to Glenn, but it looks like I didn't, so I will take full blame for that. I did send it over to James just now, so we'll make sure we get that out to the board right away.
Yeah, I'll probably send an email before I leave today, if not first thing tomorrow morning.
So next thing on the agenda is the overhead rate. This is an item that we do every year following the approval of the budget. And I'll go through it a little bit today in detail, and hopefully if Director Boyd Hodgson is not familiar with the item, hopefully I can explain it well enough. I think Director Sinella has seen it every year for the last forever, so he probably has a good understanding. But the agenda on the overhead rate, first we'll talk about the
Not
purpose.
forever, just for 6 years.
And we do it twice every year for 6 years, so you've seen it 12 times. in fact.
I have seen it a lot, yes.
Yeah. So we'll go over the purpose of the overhead rate, and we'll talk about the background. Next, we'll go over our methodology for calculating it. And then we'll talk about the current year's calculation. We'll compare it to prior years. And then we'll go over the next steps. So the purpose of the overhead calculation is we do it because it is a GAAP requirement. It's required according to generally accepted accounting principles. And it's required in order to record the actual or appropriate cost of an asset. And that actual cost of an asset is both the direct cost of the asset, meaning the materials and supplies and labor, as well as the supporting costs. So when we work on an asset, it's not only the direct materials, but it's also the overhead costs here at the district, such as electricity and any other staff that may help in basically overhead or supporting costs of the district. So what we do is we charge the direct labor costs of materials, and then we add the portion of the supporting cost to the asset. And I'll talk about that more afterwards, but it also eliminates unfair burden on the ratepayer. So we actually allocate a portion of you'll see G&A, there's an overhead allocation. We move a portion of the G&A cost to the cost of the assets, therefore reducing the operating costs and charging ratepayers less.
What is G&A?
I'm sorry, general and administrative costs. So if you look at the budget on page, I think it's 14 and 24, you'll see the general and administrative section. At the bottom of that, you'll see a line item for, let me make sure I get the exact terminology because I do not believe it's called overhead in that. So it says admin credit transfer is what it says at the bottom of the general and administrative section in the budget. So what we do is we estimate the amount of time that'll be charged to projects, and we allocate a portion of the operating cost to those projects based on that amount of time. So moving on, our methodology was established back in 2013 through a cost of service study that we did with Black & Veatch. We reviewed it every year and compare it to other agencies and industry best practices, and it's still an appropriate method for calculating overhead. It's a pretty straightforward, direct method. And basically what we do is they recommended using a single overhead rate. So what we do is we apply direct labor based on the approved budget, and it's effective July 1st of each fiscal year. And we do this, we actually apply it to billings to outside contractors, to developer projects, and to miscellaneous billings.
So I can see that it says 2013 cost of service report. Why have we, and maybe this is a larger question, but why haven't we not done a cost of service report that's more up to date? Why don't we have something that's more up to date?
So we've done cost of service studies in 2015, 17, 19, and we're working on one now. And all of them, it's been determined that it's still an appropriate calculation for the overhead. It's just, it was originally established in 2013.
Okay. Okay.
But just to clarify, Wes, the the method that you're using hasn't changed, but the amount that we charge has. It's gone up over time.
It changes every year, yeah, based on the budgeted amounts of direct labor and indirect costs.
Some years it goes up, some years it goes down slightly based on those numbers.
Okay, thank you.
So the calculation, the recommended methodology was the overhead rate is equal to budgeted indirect costs and employee benefits divided by direct labor costs. So certain departments work directly on projects such as engineering, and other departments are indirect costs, such as you might have IT or other departments like that. You add those indirect costs plus the employee benefits divided by the direct labor costs, and that's the calculation for saying what the overhead rate should be. So this next slide shows the calculation that was actually distributed. I sent it out by email this morning, and it was posted to our website under the agenda. So it was made available to the public today, first thing this morning. This slide shows the summary from the budget. It actually has a budget page number in each section. So you can see the top are the water departments, and the bottom are the wastewater departments. And these are the indirect departments. So safety and regulatory affairs, for example, buildings and grounds, information technology, and G&A. None of those departments typically work directly on projects, so they'd be considered indirect labor costs. And then this section shows the water general and administrative costs. And you can see there's the G&A transfer, which we've now added back because in the budget, we budget to remove it from G&A costs or reduce overall G&A costs by that amount. So to get the total G&A cost, you have to add the $826,000 back to the $3,134,000. That's because we're trying to get the total indirect cost for this section of the calculation. And the bottom half shows, as I mentioned, the wastewater indirect departments. It's the same departments for the most part: safety, buildings and grounds, and IT, and G&A. And again, you have the G&A transfer being added back to general administrative costs to get the total of the general administrative costs. The final number you see here are the water and wastewater benefits. We have to add those to the indirect costs because benefits are not a direct cost of projects. So then you get the total indirect costs, and that's a capital letter A because I'll be using it in a formula coming up. And the total indirect costs are $12.7 million for fiscal year 2022. So this next section shows the direct costs. So these are departments that would be working typically directly on projects or infrastructure. So you might have pumping costs, water quality, water treatment. These departments are the water departments that are direct labor costs. And the bottom half shows the wastewater departments that are direct labor costs. And the thing to note here too is these are just the labor costs from each one of those departments. And the labor costs in the budget actually include the benefit costs. So the first one under pumping, the $116,000 is labor plus benefits. So we're gonna have to, at the bottom, back out the benefits, and I'll explain that in just a minute. But the total direct cost is $9.3 million, including benefits. So now we're going to try to back out the benefits to get to the total direct cost because we know we've added the benefits to the indirect costs.
It seems very convoluted. Why do you add it in and then take it out?
Well, it's just because of the way that we budget. So when we do the budget, we don't budget for them separately. When we do the budgeted labor, it actually has labor and benefits in that total labor costs. So because we budget for it that way, we have to back it out to get to the overhead calculation. I hope that clarifies it.
Okay. This is obviously the first time I'm seeing this. And I think this is the first time for any meeting that material has been provided after the agenda has been posted. So going forward, for my benefit, because I needed some time to digest this and I didn't have that since it came through this morning. I think we should make sure that if we are, if we have some material to present like these overhead fees, that they are posted, if it's something that's going to be posted for the public and sent to us as directors, it should be posted at the same time as the agenda. because I know that I needed more time to sit with this. I don't know if we're voting on anything today about this, but I'm really uncomfortable just with my level of understanding since this is the first time I'm seeing it.
Yeah, and the committee never votes on anything. This will just be so the
Okay.
committee can see the calculation. It'll be brought to the July 21st board meeting. So that's when, so you'll have time from now until then to take a look at it. And any questions you have about it during that time, I'm happy to answer them.
Okay, thank you.
So then we have the line 33, the total district direct costs. And on page 25 of the budget, it actually breaks out the salaries and benefits, and benefits are calculated as a percentage of salaries. So they're calculated at 56.8%. So in order to back out the benefits of the direct costs, we have to reduce it in effect by that 56.8%. And that on the next line down, this direct cost less benefits, it's a nice calculation there. Gives you the direct costs at $5.9 million. So that's a total direct costs. So then the last item there is to divide the total indirect costs and the benefits of $12.7 million and divide that by the direct labor costs of $5,975,000. So the overhead rate for fiscal year 2022 is going to be 212%, 212.57%. And you can see up top, actually, and I'll show this in a minute, but last year it was 209.45. The year before was 217. So it's up about 3% this year, mainly just as a result of more indirect costs.
And the board actually sees these overhead rates usually in capital projects. When you see the capital, you see the labor that we spent on it, our direct labor, you'll see consultant labor, you'll see a breakdown, and then you'll see overhead, which is that 207, or in this case, in the future, it'll be 212 if it goes forward. And that's where it's a lot of times where the board actually see these numbers. So that labor cost is shown both on capital jobs and on replacement jobs. So it hits both sides.
And it's important to note that this is an allocation of overhead costs to costs of projects. So by this going up from 209 to 212, it means as we charge $1 of labor to a project, 212% of that gets allocated from operating costs and moved to the cost of the project and billed to the contractor or outside service person or on miscellaneous billings. So it's moved from operating costs. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that the overhead rate goes up. It is our actual cost of overhead, and it's just allocating it to the projects and actually saving ratepayers money. So next is the prior year comparisons. Here we can see the last 5 years of the overhead rate, as well as the indirect and direct total costs. In 2018, it was 221%. It went down to 209 by 2021, and then it's coming back up to 212 a little bit this year. And you can see the indirect costs went up from 2021 to 2022, as I mentioned, by about $330,000. And with that, the next steps are this will be going to the Board of Directors meeting on July 21st, 2021. And at that meeting, we will be requesting to adopt the ordinance establishing the new overhead rate for this fiscal year. And that's all I have for the overhead rate.
What? I have a lot of questions because I think that I'm missing some very fundamental things about this. What are the implications for adopting the ordinance rate? Like, I really am missing some basic stuff about this. So what are the implications for adopting the ordinance rate? Why do we do that?
So what happens
I'm sorry, the overhead rate.
Yeah, so right now the current overhead rate is 209%. So last year that was adopted, and what happens is for projects that we bill out, anytime we charge labor to it, if it's to a contractor, we have to allocate certain costs of the building and supporting staff. And currently that amount being allocated it's like 2% of the labor rate, right? So you'd have, if the labor rate was $1, you'd put another $2 on top of that. So you'd be charging $3 to that project. And the $2 is to cover the cost of, running the building, paying for electricity, other costs that we have at the district that are not directly related to that project. So the implications of approving it this year, what we're saying is per our budget, we think we're going to have more indirect costs. So it's going to cost us more to run the facilities than it did last year. There's going to be more just indirect supporting costs. And because of that, we need to charge contractors and people, other miscellaneous billings, a little bit more than we did last year. So instead of putting $2.09 on top of our $1 of labor, we're going to be putting $1 plus $2.12 onto that bill for the contractor. So it'd be
Hey, Wes, could you give us like a real life example as to when you might apply this overhead to a contractor?
I can too.
What types of projects are we talking about?
So this is for, here, let me go back to this slide here. For outside contractor costs, for developer projects, for miscellaneous billings. So it's for all three of those. So anytime James has a project, we're going to apply overhead to it for an outside contractor. A simple example is if someone were to hit a fire hydrant outside and we had to go in and repair that fire hydrant and bill someone for their insurance. We would not only, if there were any materials for repairing the infrastructure pipes there, we'd bill them for the pipes, which would be the direct costs, but then we'd also bill our direct labor for working on that, putting it back together. And then you've got the cost of supporting that person, employing them here at the district, which would be the indirect costs, right? So say one of our staff went out, we charged $1 of labor to repair that hydrant. We don't own hydrants, so we're not paying for those, but the infrastructure related to it. So if he charged $1 of labor, we're going to add on another $2 because we have to support him, like employ him or her, pay for the cost of having them work here. So it'd be another $2.09. So then we would bill the person's insurance, the $3 of labor plus the cost of the pipes and everything else that went into that hydrant that was hit because we had to replace our infrastructure.
Directors, in my previous life, I worked on the consulting side, on the private side, and this is very similar to me as what we did as consultants. So when I was an engineering consultant, we had IT, HR, the building rent, computers, all the overhead benefits, and then of course we had profit built in. In this case, there's no profit. And then that's what we would bill our clients. In this case, engineering does a lot of that billing when we work on a project, or as Wes's example, if somebody hits a fire hydrant, we want to make sure our full burden cost, that overhead is our burden cost. It's very similar to a burden cost as in the private side, except there's no profit in it. It's just purely our direct and indirect expenses divided by the labor hours that we charge to projects.
So it's a markup.
It's actually it's the burden rate, right? And so
Gotcha.
if you pay an employee $30 an hour, his benefits, the support,
Social Security, state unemployment, federal unemployment, all the tax.
all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, so if you owned your own business and you were to build something for someone, you couldn't build in just what you think your time was worth. You'd also have to make sure you built in the cost of your electricity and running the building and everything else. So that would be your labor plus the overhead cost. It's fully burdened cost of it.
Your insurance, your liability insurance, your medical, all that stuff. Yeah.
All those indirect costs that don't go directly with just building that one piece of equipment.
Got it. Thank you. That was really helpful. And I appreciate you sort of taking it back to the basic level for me. So who are we charging? Like what kinds of companies are we charging this to? Is it companies? Is it our folks are doing the work? I guess I'm also a little bit confused about that. So who are we charging this rate?
Well, I could talk from the engineering side. For the engineering side, we're really charging ourselves. We're allocating that cost to our infrastructure so we know how much it costs. So if we build a pipeline and we're spending lots of labor hours on that pipeline, there was both direct costs and that burden, that overhead burden costs on that pipeline. And that's the asset value. So that's coming off basically what our ratepayers essentially, and Wes, please correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, would be paying and being allocated to that asset, which is a pipeline in this case. Now,
and allocated over the life of the the asset itself. Not so in effect, you're reducing the burden on the ratepayers, because if the asset lasts for 20 years, you're moving a portion of the cost to that asset and dividing it by 20 years versus charging the ratepayers a one-time charge of that full amount.
And then on the other case scenario is if we perform labor for somebody that we're getting reimbursed for, whether it's a hit fire hydrant or physical work done, to install something or fix something for a customer, and they're reimbursing us. We're not only getting the direct cost of paying our employees to do that work, but we're getting that overhead burden cost, which is they're really true costs because each employee has benefits, they have sick time, they have vacation, they have insurance. So we're collecting that back. So this way our ratepayers are not being subsidized, or we're not subsidizing our ratepayers.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Yes. So the whole purpose of it is to make sure we record the actual cost of an asset or the actual cost of a job. And that actual cost has to be the direct labor, the labor directly related to producing it, plus the materials. And then, of course, the supporting costs, which we're talking about now, which would be the, even if it's for our own asset we're building, we want to make sure we allocate those supporting costs to appropriately cost that asset.
Thank you.
I don't have any other questions. And so what's the next steps? We're going to bring this to the full board on the 21st?
Yeah, that's correct. So we'll have the ordinance brought to the board on July 21st.
I just out of curiosity, because in my private life, I utilize a lot of contracted services and consultants, and I'm very familiar with the markup or the overhead, recovering those. But even in the private sector, when you have profit involved, which we do not, I've never seen anything even close to 212%. It's usually 1.67 or 1.7. I know that we have a benefit package and a medical package that a lot of the private sector's employees don't have, but I mean, is 2.12, does that's pretty high.
Well, I could speak on the engineering side. It's with the profits in the 3.2 to 3.5. And I think Director Eltop has mentioned the engineering group charges something like 5 as an overhead rate, and their operations group charges in the 3s from his previous life at Rancho. And I don't recall what it used to be at OTI when I used to work there after I left consulting. But Wes, you probably know better than I do.
Well, OTI did a different methodology. They used the standard labor costing for it. So they, in effect, may have tripled their rate for each labor class. They, if it was an engineer, they might say, even if they were paid $20, we're going to charge everyone $60, and that'll be our standard labor rate for that position. So they built it into, a different, much more complicated methodology.
So, but as far as in the engineering in community, above 3 is pretty standard, but I can't speak to other industries.
Yeah. No, I was just curious. I think it sounds like you guys have a solid methodology to come up with it. It's one that's been around for a long time, and I'm assuming that it's based off of, like you mentioned, West industry best practices. It was even here before our current administration, that methodology. And so, I trust it. It just seems high. And I just want it to be fair. I want it to be fair to every, our ratepayers, but also, I want it to be fair to an insurance company. If somebody does hit a fire hydrant and we need to send our crew out there to go fix it, I want them to be charged appropriately, but not overcharged necessarily. And so we want fairness, all the way around if we can get it.
And that fairness is established through our budget process and keeping all of our costs as low as possible. And the overhead is calculated, using those budgeted costs. You can see here that, we have to have a safety and regulatory affairs department. We need buildings and grounds, and this is what it costs us to provide those. And we, being not for profit, we are only providing services, what we have to spend on it. So it's should be a fair calculation based on that.
Okay. Thank you. Well, if there's no other comments, then we can go ahead and move on to item number 3, status of debt issuance.
Go ahead, Wes. I think this one's yours also.
Oh, unfortunately, we're supposed to have Laura and oh, they're here. Robert's here twice. Okay, well, that's great. So I get to pass this one off as well, at least the beginning portion of the debt issuance update. As you know, we've been working on a debt issuance. We've had several meetings and updates on this. We're just going to walk through the financing schedule, and Laura's going to give an update of where we're at on that in that process. So with that, I'll introduce Laura, and it looks like Robert's here as well. So welcome, Laura.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, committee members. I wanted to give a brief overview of our schedule to date. We've gone through with both of you multiple transactional assumptions on what has come forward and what needs to happen in order to put this bond issuance back to the board for approval, and then of course onto the pricing and closing. What we currently have done so far is staff has done a great job of working through all of the necessary edits to the preliminary official statement. We're working to push that out to the rest of the finance team to get some further comments. And we're on track to get the documents, both on the legal document side, as well as the disclosure documents, ready for board to review it at its August 4th board meeting. Prior to that, we are looking to get these draft documents over to the rating agencies in the next couple of weeks. So we'll have Fitch and S&P review both the legal documentation as well as the POS and prep for the upcoming calls with both those rating agencies. We've scheduled preliminarily that call to occur on July 21st. Then will allow about a week to 2 week time frame for the rating agencies to review the documents, ask any questions, and follow up with a rating. So we hope to bring forward to the board not only the approval of the documents, but as well the confirmation of where the rating will be on the 2021 bond debt issuance. We've also incorporated Morgan Stanley into our transaction. So we'll have them involved in our upcoming debt issuance discussions with the board, and they have presented some debt structures to staff for review, but it's in line with our prior discussions with the committee and the board, and we're happy to review those in more detail going forward. But everything is on track, and we're looking to keep the schedule on date and on time.
Great, thank you, Laura. Any questions?
Great work. Thank you.
Great.
Awesome.
Thank you, Laura.
Thanks for the update. Okay, moving on to number 4, our reserve policy.
There you go ahead, Wes. I believe this one's yours too.
It is. Let me just get this open. Okay, hopefully you can see that.
Yep.
This could have been a very long presentation. I'll try not to talk for too long. I started working on it and spent a ton of time, and hopefully I can keep it a little brief. I cut out some parts that I had in there from before, so I'll go through it and we'll see how it goes. So the reserves and reserve policy of the district. Today, I'm going to go over first the background. I want to talk about why districts have reserves and how they're established. Then I'll go over the district's policy. I'll talk about our reserve levels. We'll go over the quick review of days in cash. And then we'll do the agency comparison. Then we'll do a reserve level comparison. And then we'll actually compare our rates and our capacity fees to other agencies. And finally, we'll go over the constituent suggestions. There was a director's question at the previous board meeting to do pros and cons on that. And I've tried to do hopefully address that. I don't know how thoroughly, but we'll see how we do in looking at that. Oh, so there's that. That's not supposed to be there. First mistake on the first slide. That's not good. That's what happens when you put in a lot of animations, I guess. So the background, the reserve policies are established based on industry best practices. And those industry best practices are established by the Government Finance Officers Association, as well as the California Special Districts Association. And looking at those two best practices, they establish the purpose of reserves, the objectives of those reserves, and guidance on how to establish reserves. You can see how that was supposed to come in afterwards. That's okay. So the background and actually looking at that again, the purpose of the reserves is to establish stable rates for our customers. That's got to be number one. And then to have a well-maintained infrastructure. Also, we want to have access to financing. By having sufficient reserves, we will maintain and improve, or possibly even improve, our credit rating. And then finally, to address volatility and uncertainty by sort of like planning for unanticipated expenses and large infrastructure costs. And a famous person once said, if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. So the reserve policy objectives are to provide adequate short-term and long-term funding, to minimize adverse budgetary impacts, and to focus on fiscal sustainability. So how do you establish a reserve policy? Well, the first and probably the most important thing is to identify the uniqueness of the district or agency and tie those reserves based on that uniqueness into the financial plan. And also, reserves need to be established that are clearly identified by category and purpose and tied to meaningful targets. And finally, reserves need to be established to determine, or I shouldn't even say that, I should say, to determine how much is enough for reserves, you need to ask the question, does it meet the district's plan? So now looking at Vallecitos Water District reserve policy, starting with a little fountain up in the top left. Don't pay attention to that yet. All of our cash and investments are currently reserved and defined. And to present this, I'm kind of going to do a budget approach, a bucket approach. And I have to admit that I found this presentation from a previous presentation, and I thought it was interesting, so I'm reusing it. But the first priority in that bucket approach is going to be to fill the operating reserves bucket. And as you know, our operating reserves are established as 180 days or 6 months of our budgeted operating expenses. So next, the second step for the district's policy is when our operating reserves are full, once we've established 180 days of operating expenses, we then fill our replacement reserves bucket. And that replacement reserves bucket, as we've discussed on several occasions, the floor is established as 3 years of projected system replacement costs. And I'm actually I think I'd mentioned in my email, we're gonna be referring to pages 125 and 126 of the budget. I'm hoping to explain that a little further because there are a lot of numbers there. It's at the very back of the budget, and I'm not sure how often the directors look at that or whether it's understood how that calculation is done. So hopefully we'll go into a little more detail about that and clarify it. But it relates to the 3 years of projected system replacement costs, and the ceiling is set at 10 years of projected system replacement costs for water and 8 years of projected system replacement costs for sewer. And as we mentioned, that was the most recent change to the reserve policy under Resolution 1450 to actually shorten the depreciable life of the sewer assets and also to shorten the required years for the ceiling. And finally, in the reserve policy, the third step is if we fill up our operating reserves and we fill our replacement reserves and we reach the ceiling, then we have the rate stabilization bucket to fill. So anything above the ceiling goes to rate stabilization, which can be used in future years to mitigate the need for rate increases. But also noteworthy is in our reserve policy, and I think it was a couple reiterations ago when the OPEB was established, we had a required amount for contributions to OPEB. So we actually established an OPEB fund in the reserve policy so that said, once we're over the operating reserves and over the replacement reserves, then we would fund the necessary requirement for the OPEB fund. But now that we're fully funded on the OPEB and all that money's in a trust, it's not likely that we'll need to fund the OPEB fund anymore. One thing we have discussed though is adding in the PERS fund. So if we do go over the replacement reserve ceiling, to actually fund PERS to keep that at a funded level that may be established later by the board. Say we want to keep it at 95%. So instead of sending in just additional discretionary payments per the budget, we could have it established in our reserve policy to keep that at a funded level. So one thing to note is that the district has targets that are sensitive to escalating replacement needs. So the district has, I think I mentioned this before, and I'm sure I'll mention it again in this presentation. We have $390 million in depreciable assets. So we have $390 million in capital assets that are depreciating that we need to replace going forward. That's a lot. And if you compare it to other agencies, there are other agencies, but there aren't that many. So in order to really have a good comparison, you need to consider that. But I mentioned on page 125, this slide is a lot of numbers, and hopefully I can kind of focus with my circles here in a minute. But this slide shows the assets that have been added by the district over the years. So we started adding assets based on the audited financial statement. So this is the historical cost of those assets since 1957. So for example, in 1957, we added $923,000 in infrastructure assets to the district. So now what we do is every year we inflate those costs added per the audited financial statements by an ENR factor, which is it's called the Engineering News Record or the Construction Inflation Index. So since 1957, the current ENR factor would be 16.23 to those assets. So assets that cost $923,000 in 1957 are estimated to cost $14.9 million today to replace. And those assets are obviously over like almost 70 years old. And per our reserve policy for water, those assets start depreciating at year 40 and depreciate until year 70. So which means you have 1/30th, or actually it's 1/31st of those assets being we need to replace each year, and you can see that in this column here. So the 1957 assets, for example, 1/31st of that $14.9 million is $483,234. So, and since that was the 923 is all the assets that were added that year. So we're not looking at individual assets because that'd just be a way too complicated calculation to get, to break out all the individual assets. So the total assets that year are estimated to have $483,000 needed to be replaced in 2022 for this fiscal year. And you can see for each one of the years since then, 1958 through 1983, a portion of those assets are estimated to need to be replaced in 2022. And our reserve policy states that we will do, or let me go to 1 year first. So the total for 1 year of replacement of estimated infrastructure is $3,113,086. It's actually less than our current CIP budget, but the total for the 3 years, which is our floor, is $10,394,000, and I can't read, $35. So that's how the floor is established based on the estimated cost of replacing assets. So it's a very detailed and I don't want to say precise, but it's a good calculation for estimating the cost of replaceable assets. And the ceiling is 10 years, so that'd be $40,281,766. So if there are no questions about the replacement costs, I'll move on to the summary of the district policy.
I do have a quick question because
Sure.
It seems like we've sat through, I've sat through some meetings where, we find out that the infrastructure isn't the theoretical life of it isn't matching up to the actual life of it. So when we're talking about, depreciating assets along a theoretical lifespan, how do we accommodate that if we find that some of our assets aren't, the depreciation schedule isn't what's matching up in reality? Or do we do that cross check and adjustment?
I'm gonna say, I don't think we do that cross check. Our depreciable useful lives are established based on accounting principles. And, the auditors look at our financial assets and our assets and they say equipment has a life of 3 to 8 years. Infrastructure might be 20 to 70 years, and we depreciate it based on that. And we look at our annual depreciation, which is about $10 million. But overall, do we reconcile individual assets? Not really. It'd be very complicated to go through our fixed asset listing and see if they have the correct depreciation.
Sure. I can see how that would be very complicated. It seems like though we have some data. I wonder if we could just take a sample and cross-check it, because it might tell us that we need a higher floor, for example. I just think if we have those data, that information available to us to do kind of a feedback check, it seems like it might be worth doing, like just taking a sample to see, how on target we are with some of those estimates.
So James is going to have a field day with this, because we recently hired an asset management supervisor and started that department to do exactly what you're talking about. And there is a full-on plan for looking at all of our infrastructure and estimating the actual life of it and the actual replacement costs. And James loves to tell me about this, and we're working together, finance and engineering, and this is an excellent project. And it was brought on, how long's Susan been here now? 2 years?
Yeah, about 2 years. But I'm really impressed, because a lot of times when I tell Wes about this, I feel like he's not listening, but he actually regurgitated almost everything I said perfectly. So Wes, I take back every bad thing I've ever said about you.
Everything? Wow.
Everything. Yeah.
That's a lot.
So, I know it's a lot.
All right.
No, but in all seriousness, Director, so we do have an asset management plan. This year's budget that the board approved allows us to move forward. Over the last 2 years, we've been building the foundation for that plan, which had to be built by staff, because without it, if we hired a consultant to do it, we didn't have the foundational information to give them. So the results of the plan will be us actually monitoring our asset and comparing our asset versus and making decision points. Is it time to replace? Does it make sense to keep on repairing that old car? Is it time to get a new one? And what's the life cycle and where are we on the life cycle? One of the results of that will be working with finance and giving Wes and his team another input point. So you have all the the accounting standards and the industry standards, and this will just be one more metric of a theoretical plan of how we need to replace our assets over time, over the lifespan of the assets, and then we could track them. We could track them and compare them, and our end results will be not only a plan, metrics that we can report back to management, and metrics that we can hopefully report back to the board on our asset management plan, and if we could extend useful life, for example. So that's about a 2-year process to put that plan together, probably 3-year process before we're all done. And the board just approved that budget this fiscal year to get that started. So we won't be there for about 3 years, but it is underway. And we will have data points to work with finance in the meantime.
Great. That sounds really exciting. I can't wait to hear about it.
So that's the replacement costs, which James will be changing completely in the future. No, I'm just kidding. We'll be validating in the future. But overall, the district reserve policy, replacement reserves are tied to meaningful targets. They're not arbitrary because they're based on estimated replacement costs. All of our cash investments are reserved and have a purpose. And we have an unambiguous balance determination for everything. Our targets are sensitive to escalating replacement needs as well. So the district's policy has been established over years and years. It was developed by experts, and it's helped us maintain our AA, actually improved to a AA plus rating. So overall, the district's policy, and it's also been reviewed by Laura and her team, and who could ask for a better team to review your policy, right? So I almost got a smile out of her. So next we'll look at our replacement reserve limits or levels. And this was a slide that Director Boyd Hodgson actually showed at the last board meeting. It's included in the budget on pages 123 and 24, I believe. It shows our water and wastewater replacement reserves. We can see here it has the floor and the ceiling and the balances over the next 5 years. And this is how our reserve levels are established. We, through that 5-year and specifically, more importantly, 10-year plan, we're able to establish appropriate reserve levels. And we do this through factors such as days in cash, debt service coverage ratios, and just looking at the balance, levels. Because like now we're close to the ceiling, but by the end of the 5-year plan, for example, for water, we'll be at 35 million, which is closer to our floor of 20 million. And as you saw, I mean, our depreciation is $10 million a year. So 20 million is in effect 2 years of depreciation. And that may be a conservative estimate, depending on what James comes back with the asset management plan. And then for sewer, after 5 years, we'll be at 42 million, which is pretty close to the floor of $34 million for sewer. There are a lot of sewer projects, and sewer assets are depreciating a lot quicker and need to be replaced quicker than the water assets. So we believe those reserve levels to be sufficient. And as I mentioned, another factor we look at is our days in cash. And this is something that all the rating agencies look at. And the orange line here shows the Fitch AA rating. This is the median for water and sewer for Fitch. So with a AA rating, Fitch, the medians are 545 days in cash. That kind of gives you an idea of what other agencies have for days in cash. And the median level, that's 545. So it shows you how the district compares. And currently we're at 578. And that's mainly a result of the debt proceeds coming in that would increase the days in cash. But over the next 5 years, that amount's going to be dropping down to 432. So we need to keep that at a sufficient level, along with our debt service, to maintain our credit rating, which is currently shown here at AA+. And we're actually going out for surveillance right now. We were reaffirmed last year, and we're going out for surveillance now for the debt issuance. So it's important that we keep all this in mind when looking at our reserve policy, that it's, in the past, it's served us well, and we hope to maintain or even improve that credit rating. And it's the debt issuance we're looking at. If Laura, I don't know if she mentioned it today, but the last update on that was that the all-in total cost was at 2.48%. So much less than 3%, which is, in my mind, incredible. And we're able to get that because we have a AA+ rating. So next thing I want to look at is we had a request to do an agency comparison, and this is where I got to spend a lot of my time. Yes.
Before that, and Director Sinella, directors, we have a hand up from Gail Martin. I don't know if you want to wait till after the presentation or would like to speak now.
In this more casual environment, let's go ahead and have her speak now. So if she wants to ask a question about something that's being talked about right now, we don't forget or we don't move on to a different topic.
Okay, I'll let her in. Ms. Martin, you should be able to speak.
Yes, can you hear me at this point?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Yes, I'm really glad that Susan Bowman is on the team, and she is a real dynamite staff member to have. I'm pretty sure that she is actually physically walking around and looking at a lot of these assets, and also working with the engineering to do any kinds of means testing to see how things are along in their depreciation rate. This is a good way to manage our assets and to keep really on track and keep on top of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So the next item to present is we had a request to do an agency comparison, as we were looking at our reserve policy and actually got the policies of 10 other agencies, and we wanted to compare and contrast and see how the district's reserve policy relates to those. So this is going to be very sort of convoluted and a lot of stuff, so prepare yourself. I did my best to summarize it, but when we look at this, you have to remember that every agency is different. So here's an agency comparison. Hopefully you can read it. I had to break it down into 2 slides because there are 10 agencies and a lot of columns. Overall, the sort of biggest commonality I found is that typically agencies have an operating reserve, a replacement reserve, or a capital reserve, and a rate stabilization reserve. There are several other types of reserve that's, certain agencies have reserves for scholarships, arbitrage, land sales, many other just different reserves that would be unique to that agency. But overall, in order to compare and contrast, I summarized it by operating, replacement, and rate stabilization. And you can see in the first row, it shows our operating reserves, which our target is 180 days or 6 months of operating expenses. And again, our minimum or our floor is 3 years of replacement costs. Ceiling is 10 years. And then our rate stabilization target is the excess of reserve balance over the ceiling. And then the bucket approach where operations is funded first, then capital replacement, and then OPEB and rate stabilization. So how does that compare to other agencies? I don't want to go through all of them because there are 10. Happy to provide this Excel spreadsheet to anyone who would like to have it. I'll go through 3 or 4, hopefully, and before I put you to sleep. But if we look at Rincon, for example, their operating reserve, they have a minimum of 90 days of operating expenses and a maximum of 180 days. And then for their replacement, they actually have 35% of their 5-year CIP. And they have established a rate stabilization reserve where their target is 10% of their water purchases. And they also have an appropriated expense fund for any unexpended funds. So if they don't spend all the money on their CIP, anything that's not spent goes into a separate fund for appropriated expense funds to be used for future capital projects. Now, if we look at Padre Dam, their replacement reserve, they actually don't have, I have a note over there, which I'll talk about, should talk about last, I guess, but so there's nothing in operating right now, but we'll get back to that. But their replacement, they have a 1-year debt principal payments plus 1 year of CIP plus funding for any specific plant upgrades that they have budgeted. And their maximum for their replacement is they have 1 year of debt principal payments, 2 years of CIP, plus funding for any budgeted plant upgrades. So it's just twice the CIP on that one for the maximum. For their rate stabilization, they've established that at 1 year of debt interest plus 3 months of operating expenses, plus loss of net revenue from 10% loss of sales. That's interesting. And then, or must be loss of net revenue up to 10% loss of sales or something like that. Similar for the max, they have 1 year of debt interest, 6 months of operating expenses, plus loss of net revenue up to 10% of sales, up to 20% of sales for the max. And then I have noted over here that their operating reserves are actually titled their rate stabilization, which functions like our operating reserve. So their rate stabilization fund, which is the 1 year of interest plus 3 months of operating expenses, is in effect an operating reserve. They've just called it rate stabilization. And you'll find that in different places. Like I said, there are different names for replacement, can be called capital. Rate stabilization can be utilized differently. If you look through the policies, you'll see the structures of every agency is very different. And so putting them in a relatable means like this is kind of difficult. But that's one thing to note is that they call their operating reserves rate stabilization funds. And then if we look at Helix Water District, their operating reserves, their target is 10% of operating revenues in the 5th year of their financial projection. So when they do their 5-year budget, they look at what their operating reserves are projected to be in 5 years, and they set their operating reserves at 10% of that for their operating revenues. And then their target for replacement is the actual needs of the reserves set during the budget process, and they don't have a timeline specified for that I noticed. So it could be the full 5 years, 10 years, it doesn't really specify. It just says the actual needs of the reserve set during the budget process. And they have a rate stabilization set at 5% of billing revenue for the minimum and 10% of billing revenue for the maximum. They also have several other special purpose reserves, such as a scholarship reserve, an arbitrage reserve, and a land sales reserve. So they have a very complicated policy with many reserves. So then moving on, I'll skip that page to go to the next one and talk about a neighboring agency that we have here in Alevenhain. Alevenhain has their operating reserve set at, and they break it down similar to us. They differentiate even further than we do between water and sewer. So they have, for water, they have 60 days of operating expenses for their minimum and 120 days for their maximum. And for the replacement, they have 1 year of the average of the 10-year CIP budget. And for the replacement maximum, they have 5 years of the average of the 10-year CIP budget. And then they've established rate stabilization at 25% of average budgeted water sales for 2 years. And the maximum of their rate stabilization is 50% of average budgeted water sales for 2 years. And then I just noted that they differentiate between water and sewer. So looking at sewer, their operating reserves are set at 180 days as the minimum, which is our target. And their maximum for sewer is 365 days of operating expenses for the sewer operating reserves. For the replacement reserves for sewer, they have 2 years of the average of the 10-year CIP budget. And for the maximum for sewer, they have 5 years of the average of the 10-year CIP budget. And then it looks like the rate stabilization is very similar to the, oh, it's not actually. So for the minimum for rate stabilization is 25% budgeted wastewater operating expenses. And for the maximum for rate stabilization, it's 100% of the budgeted wastewater operating expenses. And that's, so that's just a taste of some of the stuff you can see in comparing and contrasting reserve policies. And really the overall takeaway I think from this is that every agency is very different, and it's really apples to pavement to, if you want to kind of compare the policies. They have some things in common, but every agency is very unique and has different needs. So those are the 10 agencies that we got reserve policies for and compare and contrasted. We also wanted to look at the, well, and sort of to wrap that up, I wanted to look at the reserve levels of all these agencies. So I took the agencies here and I actually compared their reserve levels currently in their audited 2020 financial statements. So here's a chart showing reserve levels of those agencies we just talked about. And you can see that with districts that have more than $300 million in depreciable assets, this is the reserve levels of those districts. Vallecitos is actually closer to the bottom, mainly because of the two big ones at the top, because they've got Western Municipal and Desert Water Agency have almost $200 million for Desert and well over $200 million for Western Municipal. After that, you got Padre Dam. They've got about $110 million in reserves. Cucamonga, which is very similar in size to Vallecitos as far as budget and assets, they're around $100 million. And then Otay, Leeuwenhoek are right next to us in the size of their reserves. And then Sweetwater and Helix came in at the lowest. But this gives you an idea.
These are all three different kinds of reserves if they have them combined. This
Correct.
is operating, replacement, and rate stabilization.
Correct. This is the total reserves for all these districts. So
These are,
then,
hey, West, these are replacement reserves, right?
no, these are total. This includes operating as well.
Okay.
And for our ceiling and floor for replacement is current costs, not, I noticed on some of the other comparisons, and that was a lot of work, and I really appreciate that you did it. For some of the other, if you like on the previous two slides, it says, 10-year CIP budget for Leeuwenhoek, for example. So that's the cost. That's the 10-year CIP. Like 10 years from now, that's what the capital improvement budget would be. It's not currently, right?
Well, they'll take their 2022 budget. They have their 10-year costs of CIP, and they take the average and then take 2 years of it for the floor. So if the total budget's $120 million and the average is $12 million a year, then it'd be $24 million for the floor.
Okay, thank you.
But most of them are based on the current budgeted numbers. So that's one thing that most agencies have in common.
Okay.
So then the next thing we want to talk about, Mike Arthur's here. I don't know, he's actually on vacation today, but he was kind enough to join us. So I wanted to do I think it was at the request of the board. We have a water rate comparison that we wanted to walk through real quickly.
Hi, thanks, Wes. Speaking of water, I'm actually in the lazy river right now going around in circles, so I might be a little busy. Now, so I was tasked with doing a water rate comparison with our neighboring agencies. a combined water sewer rate comparison with our neighboring agencies. And we also did help me Wes, the third one is for the cap fees. Sorry, the cap fee comparison. And as Wes mentioned, when discussing the reserves comparisons, it's not so easy to do a one-to-one rate comparison, even with water. Some agencies, agencies have a different mix of water supply. We have desal water, which puts our costs a little bit higher. Some agencies have local water. Some agencies may put some of their costs now on their property tax bill. So what I tried to do is try to incorporate all their costs that I could get from their website, knowing that it's not 100% complete. I have about a 95% confidence interval with these numbers. Like I said, some agencies will put stuff on their property tax, and I can't get property tax information from those agencies. So real quick, so for the water rate comparison in the 22 neighboring agencies in the San Diego County Water Authority, currently we are listed as number 5. Now I want to make clear that we use a single family residence using a 5/8 inch meter with 13 units of water use a month. That is kind of a standard that's used in the San Diego County Water Agency area. So when we use these numbers, I just want to make it clear that that's what we're using. 5/8 inch meter, 13 units of water, and 1 unit of water for us is 748 gallons.
Hey, Mike, yes. Ask a question. You said that the 13 units single family residence is kind of a standard, but isn't that also kind of an average? Because I just got my bill yesterday and I was looking at it and I used 12 units. And so I'm kind of right there in that. Is that like an average for, and I live in a 2,500 square foot typical home in San Marcos.
Yes, Director. So back in 2000, before the drought mandates, what was that, 2014, 2015, our VWD average was 13. Now, after the droughts, our typical average is probably about 11.9. But for comparison, for stability in comparisons, we're still using 13, which as long as we're using 13 for every agency, it makes sense.
Yeah, it's apples to apples. Yep.
Thank you. So that's what we're trying to do. So so it is kind of amazing to me when I put these numbers together that VWD is the 5th, and do you want to say 5th best, 5th lowest, in terms of water for this type of customer, considering that we do have a desal water supply that takes about 1/3 of our supply of water. So our typical resident would pay about $92.42. And if you look on the chart on the right, the vertical orange bar is kind of where the average stands. And the average for these 22 agencies is $105.12. So VWD is about $12.70 below average for this type of customer, which is about 12% less than the average customer in this area. So if there's no questions, we'll move on to the next tab.
And is that just remind me, is that water only or water and sewer combined?
This is water only. The next one's going to be water and sewer, and I will discuss a little bit of limitations on that as well. So Wes, if you can advance it to the next slide.
And these numbers right here, because we don't know what the tier structure is across these different agencies as well. They could have a different tier structure.
Can you go back, Wes, one?
Yep.
So Director Boyd Hodgson, that's a good question. And no, I went to the website and I pulled out every single piece of information on their tier structure. I have an Excel spreadsheet that has everything listed. So if their tiers, like for example, our tier for a 5/8 meter is 0 to 6 units is tier 1, and 7 through I believe 21 is tier 2. And I'll just make this up because I don't have it in front of me. If Santa Fe, for example, had tier 1 was 0 through 10, I used their tier structure. I didn't use our tier structure and overlap them. So I went to their tier structure, their rates, their fixed charges. Some are billed bi-monthly, so I converted the bi-monthly to monthly. Some like Escondido, and I forgot the other agency, use not 748 gallons for a unit of water. They use 1,000 gallons as a unit of water. So I had to convert that as well. So this truly is an apples to apples comparison, with the exception that I mentioned that some of these agencies may put some of their costs on their property tax bill, which would then put the average possibly a little bit higher than the $105.12. So it is each individual. If you use 13 units of water, like Director Sinello was mentioning, in that agency, that's what your bill would be.
Okay, thank you.
Wow.
Excuse me. So, okay, so this then is the total bill comparison. Now this includes the water and the sewer charge. Now, I want to kind of make clear, including sewer is a lot harder because VWD, we do water and sewer for most of our customers, 90 to 95% of our customers. We have about, I think it's 1,800 customers that are sewer only. So like those customers might be in Escondido, San Marcos, Vista, that we do just their sewer. There's some agencies that don't provide sewer. Another agency would provide the sewer for them. And it might not be a one-to-one, like OMWD does sewer for several of these agencies listed. So what I tried to do is try to look up on the website, and I did a search to see, for example, and I'll make this up too because I don't have the spreadsheet in front of me, who does sewer for Santa Fe Irrigation District? And it might have been two different agencies that did sewer for them. So I had to either pick I did either an average of the two, or I picked one that said they did 70% of that district. So it's a little bit harder doing a total bill comparison because it's not a one-for-one. So I also want to make that clear that if you were to say, we're going to publish this and put you under oath and all that, that this is a best information that we could gather from the websites. So VWD and the combined water bill, and Wes, if you can click one more. So I like doing the numbers because I'm a numbers guy, but I know most people like charts. So I included both of them side by side. So VWD is the fourth lowest of the combined. And again, the water portion would be the single family residence 5/8" meter using 13 units of water. And including the sewer portion, which for us, $38.99, I believe, for a single family residence, VWD's total bill for that type of customer would be $131.41. And the average of the 22 agencies is $166. So combined, VWD is about $35 below the average, which is about 21% below average for this market. So we're going to move on to the cap fees, but I just want to stop there and see if there's any questions before we go into the cap fees.
I know that this took a lot of time and effort, and I really appreciate you putting it together. It's very straightforward. You know, what you're showing here is the cost of the water and the cost of the sewer services. It doesn't reflect, of course, you know, the ready to serve and the pumping charges and things like that. So
it does include ready to serve, Director Boyd Hodgson. It does include ready to serve. It does not include pumping charges because, well, I didn't include pumping charges for any of the agencies. Most of the agencies will charge pumping charges because that is not really a water charge. It's more of a or less of a pass-through of San Diego gas and electric charges for the pumping of that. So some agencies might be flat ground, there's no pumping. Some agencies might be very hilly, there is some pumping. So because of that discrepancy, I just totally excluded pumping charges, but it does include the ready to serve charge.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
You're welcome. So now we'll move on to the cap fee comparison. And if Wes, you can, this one's a little smaller. Okay, so for cap fees, again, it's not a one-to-one comparison, and James, you can help me if there's any harder questions on this for me. But because if an agency is totally built out, they might not even have a cap fee, or they might have different calculation in order to and how to do that cap fee. So I would say that it's much not apples to apples when you're doing connection fees or the cap fee comparison. Again, I tried to gather as much as I could for the water and sewer, went to the district's websites. I would have called the district if there was any ambiguity in there. And on this one, VWD is ranked 16th. So that would be, I have it, you know, order of ascending order. So we're the 16th lowest, third highest, however you want to calculate that. So we are near the top of the total combined fee structure. Our water connection fees are about $7,900, and our sewer connection fees are currently almost around $13,000. So combined, it's almost $21,000. So you'll see that. Oh, and I didn't put the average there, but the average. Oh, I'm sorry, it is. The average is about $15,200. So we are about 33% higher than the average bill for connection fees total combined water and sewer.
Mike, when you looked at these agencies, you just get their cap fees off their website.
I did.
But for one EDU or one fee for water, one fee for sewer.
That's right. And I know, James, you mentioned before that some are not comparable because they'll do it by like bathroom or something like that. Or by,
there's several of these agencies. I know this for a fact because I work with their engineers and I work with them, and I work when I was a consultant, I work with them, and they still do the same methodology. I'll use Rainbow as an example. Their numbers for water are and for sewer, but for water especially, is based on having 2 or less bathrooms and under 20, I forgot the square footage, like less than 2,000 something square feet of house. So if you build a house that's larger than 2,100 square feet, or you have more than 2 bathrooms, then you actually pay more. Santa Fe, I don't think they did that anymore. They used to do that, but several of the other agencies do that also. So that standard fee actually is even higher. While ours is even if you build a 3,500 square foot home, if you have a standard meter, then you get charged for that standard 5-inch or 3/4 inch meter, and then a standard EDU for a single family home for sewer side.
That's right. And it was a lot harder looking on their website to differentiate between that. So I just did a 1 EDU, and like James mentioned, it could possibly be higher, which would make some of these agencies a little bit more.
Hey, Wes, on these developer fees, and while I didn't realize that we were in the top 3 for the highest developer fees in the region, but does this include the annexation fee if they're not currently in our system? Because one constituent who's politicizing this issue has said that we should have a buy-in, right? When isn't the annexation fee a bit of a buy-in if they're not currently in our service area? What is what a typical annexation fee cost above and beyond this?
So I know that was addressed to me, James, but do you want to take it, or?
Mike probably has the exact numbers, but
yeah, I know I have the email of what the annexation fees are, but I don't have them offhand, Director. And seeing as I'm not in San Diego, it's going to be harder for me to get that right now. So if you wouldn't mind, we can get back to you on that.
Yeah,
I can give you the exact numbers, but it's I can't remember which one's which, but it's like close to 6,000 for maybe water, and I think sewers close to 8,000 or 9,000. But don't quote me on that. We could send you that information.
No, that's fine. I mean, I don't need the exact dollar, but it's significant. It's about roughly $14,000 to buy into our system above and beyond the 21-ish thousand that's there. So
yeah, and that's per acre though.
I didn't know if that included that or not. And so so on a new home that's built in San Marcos, Vallecitos Water District is going to put roughly $35,000 onto the price of that home. If they're not currently in our service area.
If they're not currently in a service area.
Yeah, and it's not the annexation fee is a per acre charge. So if they have an acre, then you're correct. If they have half an acre, then
it's half that. Okay, I got you. Thank you for clarifying. No wonder homes were costing $1 million for starter homes.
And lumber.
Tell me about it.
So that's the end of my presentation. So if there's no other questions, we can move on.
Okay, so sorry, go ahead.
Oh, was this the end of the presentation or?
Nope, not yet.
Okay, keep going. I'll save my comments and stuff till the end.
So so just to summarize, we've gone through and we've shown how we compare for our reserve balances. We've shown how we compare for our water and sewer rates, and how our capacity fees relate to other agencies. And to summarize that, we are the 5th lowest of 10 agencies as far as reserve levels. We are the 3rd lowest of 22 agencies for water and sewer rates. And we're the 3rd highest of 18 agencies for capacity fees. So I know we get a lot of people and constituents and others talking about our rates being too high and our capacity fees being too low and our reserve levels being too high. But when you look at the actual numbers, it tells a different story. I don't think that we can debate at all that we don't have, of other agencies, we're the 5th lowest in reserve levels. So it doesn't look like we have extremely high reserves. We're the 3rd lowest.
Hey, Wes, I'm going to beg to differ, and the facts are friendly here. And you said a lot of people. I don't think it's a lot of people. I'm in the community talking to different groups between Kiwanis and Lions and Chamber of Commerce. Look, nobody likes to pay a water bill. Nobody likes to go to the gas station. Nobody likes to pay SDG&E. We get that, but I don't hear a lot of negative feedback in the community. We have one person in the community. We service roughly 100,000 constituents. We have one who's making a big issue out of this. The other 999,000 of them are not, for the most part. So let's keep it in perspective.
That's what I like to hear. I'm glad you said that, because I'd rather it not be a lot of people. So that makes me happy. Because I think when you look at the numbers, they tell the correct story, and Vallecitos is amazing, right? I need a round
Yeah, we're good.
round of applause on that one, I think. Okay, so moving on. So the next thing I want to address is we had a request to look at some of the, again, one constituent, I think it's the same one you're referring to,
Yep.
some suggestions that were brought up, and to look at some pros and cons. So I took a little bit of time. I haven't really gone into this in detail, but just briefly looked at it and tried to develop some pros and cons on the suggestions. So I'll go through those with you now. So looking at the first one, the suggestion was that we establish capital replacement reserve balances that do not exceed 5-year CIP, or alternatively, the 2 highest years in a 10-year CIP. So if we were to take our 5-year CIP and not exceed that, the ceiling for water would be somewhere around $21 million versus the current $41 million. The ceiling for sewer would be actually a lot higher, somewhere around $80 million versus the current $70 million. So you'd be raising the sewer ceiling, you'd be lowering the water ceiling. But looking at that, what would be the pros to doing it? And we've talked about what makes up a reserve policy, how to establish a reserve policy. So I'm just going to look at the pros from that perspective, not necessarily whether this is a good suggestion. But the pros of this is it's still has a clearly defined ceiling, right? And then the other pro would be that it does consider the district's 5-year plan. So 2 of the things that make up developing a reserve policy. The cons, however, it seems like there are many more for this, at least in my mind. It doesn't establish what the floor would be. It's not defined in this suggestion. There's less ability to smooth costs for a 10-year plan. So we have a 10-year CIP budget, and looking at only the 5 years of that 10-year plan doesn't incorporate smoothing those 10-year costs, which we currently do. The other thing is it really diminishes the ability to plan for uncertainty. If you're limiting your ceiling to 5 years of CIP or $20 million, if you have certain levels of, $20 million isn't a lot of money to plan or account for uncertainty. Also, and I just mentioned that it lowers the ceiling from $41 million to $21 million, which would significantly lower our water reserves and our overall days in cash and affect our credit ratings severely through days in cash and debt service coverage. And lastly, it would be a dramatic change to our reserve policy, one that hasn't been. This would probably be the most dramatic change in the, 20 years we've had a reserve policy, which would definitely reflect poorly with the credit rating agencies. So overall, I'm giving this one a thumbs down, but we'll go on to the next suggestion. So the next one would be provisions for a rate stabilization fund that allow for discretionary transfers and managing BWD's debt service coverage ratio. So the pros of this one, again, are looking at it from a development of a reserve policy. It provides stabilization of rates for customers. It also provides flexibility in the use of the funds, since it's saying it's got discretionary transfers. But the cons are, if you were to set targets and establish an actual rate stabilization fund versus how we do it now, where if it goes over the ceiling, currently we establish the rate stabilization based on excess over the ceiling. If you're to set targets, then you actually have to fund the reserve. So you'd have to charge ratepayers more money to develop this fund to keep it funded. So it could, in effect, end up costing more money to ratepayers, and I'm not sure I'm in favor of that. And then I just wanted to note that the district already has an established rate stabilization fund for both water and sewer, and our reserve policy allows for discretionary transfers from that fund. So we already have more flexibility than this suggestion would provide. Next, we're going to get into the fun stuff now because it's going to be related to the capacity funds. So include provisions for restricted funds, including capacity or developer funds. So some of the pros of this is if you were to put it in the reserve policy, it would clarify the fund and its purpose. And basically what you'd have to do is just say what it was and refer it to the governing documents, which would basically say that it's established by Government Code 66013, which is also known as the Mitigation Fee Act, and we're required to report on it separately. But that's pretty much probably the limit to what you could do for the reserve policy, because you can't really set targets. You can't use that to affect the rates of the capacity fees. So really it would just be for some clarification as far as the pros go. Now, if you were to put the capacity fund into our reserve policy, we've already got at least a couple of people who are confused with the difference in how they function between the replacement reserves and the capacity reserves. And we really want to make sure it's known that they are separate. They're never combined. They're only reported on the same reserve report because we're required to show that those funds according to the Mitigation Fee Act. We could put them on a separate report, keep them completely separate, and we do account for them separately. But by putting them into the reserve policy, it could potentially just cause further confusion about whether the funds are related to the replacement reserves. And I'm not sure that that's a good thing. So overall, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world to say, because I did see some other agencies actually say for capacity fees, they're determined based on, the cost of growth projects, and, limits are as needed for those projects. But overall, that's really all you're going to see for the most part in other reserve policies. And the next one, it suggested including provisions for restricted debt-related funds, general enough for all future issuances and consistent with arbitrage compliance, allowing for maximum utilization of debt proceeds. So this one basically deals with our debt proceeds and suggests that we include it in the reserve policy. However, the provisions for the debt issuance and the debt funds and the proceeds, it's already included in our debt management policy. And the debt management policy states that we will account for it separately, and that they'll only be used for specified projects that was issued for. So then if you put it in our reserve policy, you'd in effect be duplicating the provisions for the debt proceeds. So it's probably not necessary. And lastly, include provisions that no restricted funds should incur a negative balance. And then include specific and immediate remedies should a negative balance occur. So for this one, again, it would clarify remedies should a negative balance occur, but you'd be adding the reserve funds to the reserve policy, which is debatable whether that's a good idea. But once you add in the capacity fund to the reserve policy, if you're to say, well, if it should fall negative, then we will issue debt. All of this is actually stated in our capacity fee model. And that actually provides the guidance for how we deal with it. And we've developed a proactive approach for ensuring that we don't incur a negative balance. But if you're to state it in the reserve policy and take away the flexibility for that to happen by somehow saying that prior to that we would issue debt or do something, then what might happen is that we may be forced to issue debt when it's at a non-opportune time, and it could cause other issues. But one thing I don't like the most is that it removes flexibility that we currently have. And again, anytime you remove flexibility, it reflects poorly with rating agencies. And I'm just not really in favor of doing things that affect our rating. So that's my quick comments on the constituent suggestions, and also the end of my presentation, unless there are any questions.
Okay, are there any questions at this time?
So thank you for walking through these. I really appreciate it. And I see the value in many of these suggestions, the pros and the cons, and the objections that you raised. Some of them I'm seem like they're sort of grasping, but I think for the most part, I'm in agreement with what the pros and cons are that you listed. And I appreciate that you took the time to put this together. I think it's important, sort of on another topic, that we as an organization, so that we don't open ourselves up to legal exposure, that we do limit sort of our comments about specific members of the public. We're elected officials. And I just want to put that out there. It's sort of bothered me in the past that we have made some comments that might not be appropriate or might be sort of disparaging. So I just want to put that out there because I would not want us to open ourselves up to legal exposure. But thank you for doing this. This is really, this has been a great presentation. It's been a lot of education that I needed as a new director, and I appreciate it. So thank you for doing that.
And I just want to say, echo the thanks. Wes and Mike, phenomenal job. You can tell that you both put a tremendous amount of time and effort into this, and I appreciate it. You know, it's we've been talking a lot about the reserve policy in particular in recent months, and I think everybody would agree that we need to have, you know, a good solid amount of reserves, right? There's a million reasons why we would want to, you know, plan for unforeseen things, and just, you know, have a rainy day fund just like we would have at our house. I don't, you know, as a board member, 30,000 feet level, I don't know what the perfect reserve policy is, and guess what? Neither do any of the water districts in our region, because everyone's doing it differently, right? So there is no perfect reserve policy, and I think we have a pretty darn good one, and I think we've had one all along, and I feel better about it, again, looking at it from a 30,000 foot level, that if we had an issue with our rates were the highest in the area, our water rates, or our sewer rates were the highest in the area, then I would say, okay, maybe we need to take a closer look at our reserve policy. But we have a reserve policy that's meeting the needs of our customers and our district and our creditors, and we're doing it all the while by having some of the lowest water and sewer rates in the region. I don't know how much more time we need to spend on this topic, and you know, I'll be mindful of the former, you know, disgruntled employee, quite frankly, who's been raising this issue, and we're spending a lot of time and money. I don't know. I mean, if you could quantify how much money it cost our other 99,999 customers, Mike, you went to every single website. Those other customers paid for that, right? Because one person has a beef with the district. We got to put an end to this, and I am going to plan on bringing something to the board in the future. I'll talk to our legal counsel and I'll talk to our general manager, but we're not going to go ahead and you know, keep spending tremendous amount of hours and money of ratepayers, you know, fees on one person. It can't go on. It's madness, and so I do get a little bit heated because I'm trying to protect our ratepayers. And this is wrong, and it's been going on way too long, and I'm going to try to stop it. So I thank you so much, both of you, for putting so much time and effort in this, and it was a phenomenal job and very helpful, so thank you.
Well, thank all of you for listening to me for 2 hours.
Wes, you still have one more item though.
Yeah,
darn it. I do, don't I? Okay, well, we can move on to that last item then, unless there are any other questions or comments.
Okay, moving on to item number 5, past due accounts.
Okay, so this is just a discussion only item. It should be very brief, but I did want to bring it to the committee's attention. In September, I think it's the September 30th is the date we're looking at. The moratorium on locking customers is anticipated to be lifted. So here in finance and customer service, we're looking at that and making sure we address it to the best of our customers' interests. And we're reaching out to everyone like we always do. We send out letters, we call people whenever they're behind and they have late fees and their balance starts to increase. We've been reaching out once a month to all customers who have sort of excessive balances or high balances. And as you know, we have customers in our special care program, the ones that have reached out to us and responded to those letters, we put them in special care. We've stopped charging them late fees until they can work out their problems with COVID and work out a payment plan with us. But at this time, we still have customers that are not responding. And even though we've been sending them letters and calls every single month, we haven't got responses from customers and they have high balances. So We're looking to proactively address that. So now we're looking at potentially putting snipes on bills, so that it'll be right on the front of their envelope. And it just says, please reach out to us so we can work with you on this balance, because as of September 30th, we're going to, if you don't respond, we may have to consider locking your meter. Because without that, I don't know how else we address these past due amounts. So I just wanted to we wanted to bring it to the committee and board's attention that this will be happening, that the moratorium will be lifted. And we wanted to start to talk about how we'll address that. And one thing I mentioned is putting a snipe on the envelope to notify customers and just asking them to reach out to us. If they call us and say, I want to set up a payment plan, we're more than happy to work with them. It's the ones that might be a little more challenging are the ones that do not respond at all. So then we have to decide how we address those. So just to put it on your radar, that's what this past due balance is relating to.
And Wes, just for clarification for the board members, pre-COVID, this is what we did, correct? Or is it very similar?
Well, pre-COVID, if you're past due, we call you, we let you know it's past due, we give you a week's notice, and we call you again with a 2-day notice, and then you get a posting on your door, the 48-hour notice before we lock you. So during COVID, now it's, we were able to lock then. During COVID, we're notifying people who would have been locked, who have a past due balance, who haven't reached out to us. We're notifying them every month saying, this is, basically it can't be forgiven. So please reach out to us and work out some sort of payment plan.
One of the things that I was working with Chris Robbins on for our ag customers, because they have some administrative hoops that they have to jump through in order to sign up for the new PSAR rate. And I asked him for a list of folks in my district, and I went and I talked to them, and they really appreciated hearing from me and us working together to try to fill out the paperwork, and they have a better understanding now of what they need to do. I would like a list of people in my district that are struggling, and I'm happy to pay them a visit and just say, you really should call, because then we can put a process in place that can help alleviate the burden. And I think that, maybe they just need a little bit of a human touch. And, this probably is not the only bill that they're struggling with. They're probably overwhelmed, and, maybe a little bit of empathy and compassion. And I'm happy to try to do that with people.
Just real quick, I'm sorry, there may be some confidentiality issues with that. So I just want to lay that out there that.
Okay. Maybe can we check?
Yeah, that's what I would say. Just let's check first, because I don't want to get into any confidentiality issues.
Mm-hmm.
We'll double check and circle back with you, Director Boyd Hodgins.
Okay, thank you.
Was there anything else with that item, or was it just an informational item?
And just informational item.
Yeah, but sorry guys, I was on mute. Wes, did you say that the transition date was the 15th of September?
I think it's the end of September. I believe it's September 30th, but I know it's in September 100% on that. I'm just not sure if it's what the date is.
Okay. Do you know how many customers, what's the universe that we're talking about? What's the size, roughly?
Yeah, that's something that we're working on putting together now, but I can let you know when we have the number.
Okay, that would be helpful.
These are just the customers that have not responded, correct? Because we already have customers in the special care. We already have customers on payment programs like we typically do.
Right. So yeah, the concern are just the customers that have the higher balances that are not responding. Just kind of at this point, I hate to say it, but it almost has to be ignoring unless they don't ever check their mail, because we call and we send them a letter every month. So it'd be hard to not know. Maybe they just, are embarrassed or don't want to deal with it. It's understandable. But those are the customers that we're referring to.
Yeah. And, it really is a tough issue. But there's a lot of different ways that it's tough. There's customers that are probably struggling to pay their water bill currently, but they're still continuing to do so. Maybe they're sacrificing something else, like a trip to the grocery store or something, that for whatever reason they decided to pay their water bill. But they're paying if this were to go on, they'd be paying, the people who are paying would be paying a higher water bill to subsidize the people who are not. So we have to be mindful that the folks that are paying their water bill, they could be struggling too. And in fact, many of them probably are, unfortunately, and they're finding ways to continue to pay. So we don't want to artificially, or I don't know if that's the right word, but wrongly, inflate their bill to subsidize the ones who, are not paying. Because that's my understanding, right? If the cost to run the district is this pie, right? And so if one person, pays less into the pie or the pool, then somebody else has to pick it up. It doesn't just go away, correct?
That's correct. And that's why we can't forgive the bills, because if we were to forgive it for these customers, or the other customers would have to pay it and subsidize the cost of those bills.
Yeah. So it's definitely a complex, situation that we have to look at from all the different angles. I would like to know how many customers you're referring to.
Mhm.
And then also, if between now and the time it comes to the full board, if staff could look into any programs that either the federal or state governments are doing to perhaps help offset this. I keep hearing that maybe the rent and mortgage thing might be paid off by the state. I don't know much about it, but hearing things like that on the news. So maybe they're going to do something for utility bills. It's worth looking into. But yeah, it's going to be just one of those kind of complex issues, like everything else we deal with, a complex issue that can impact a lot of different people in different ways.
Yeah, and I've heard about the American Rescue Plan Act may include some funding for utilities, but for customers who have past due bills. So that's something that we can have, like Chris Robbins potentially reach out to customers and let them know that may be something that's available to them.
Yeah,
and that's correct. We've actually already had that discussion internally with Chris on tracking that at this point, and to see what the availability and how to access it. My understanding, it's going to be direct from customers to access it, but I don't know if that's been finalized.
Thank you for looking into that. I know that I, raised this issue at a board meeting months ago about, how it would work. And I know that we have a legislative committee, and it seems like this would fall under their purview to investigate that and, meet about that and talk about that, and then bring that to the rest of us so that we could be in the loop. I think that's definitely worth looking into. But I just want to clarify, we don't raise other people's bills because other people don't pay their water bills, right? We don't do that.
No, the cost of water is the cost of water. But if we don't have funding, then one customer is going to have to pay more if the other one doesn't. It's Mike, you want to explain that better than I can?
So it's not directly we don't, but in a way it is, as Director Stanello was saying, it's one piece of a pie. If we have to collect, and I'll just make up a number here, if we have to collect $40 million, but we only collect $39,990,000, that means we have to collect 10,000 more from those that are paying into it. So in a way, the rates would be raised. I mean, it'd be minuscule pennies. So it's like the uncollectible accounts, right, Wes? We write off some accounts that will never collect, and that money has to be made up elsewhere. So yes, it is part of the rates.
But I imagine that we raise the rates for other reasons too. I just don't want the perception to be that if these folks don't pay, then it's going to cost everybody else an arm and a leg.
That's correct. This would just be one minor portion. The rate pass-throughs from our wholesale agency is the primary driver of our rates, usually our rate increases. And then as you've seen through the budgeting process, we actually do a great job mitigating the pass-through rate increases to actually make them less for our customers. But any little thing that adds additional costs has to be allocated somewhere. So it wouldn't be immediate, but then in the next year's budget, it'd show up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that it's complex. I just want to temper the discussion a little bit, that it's not, I don't want people that are struggling and also paying their bill to be knocking on our door saying, well, you said you were going to raise rates because other people aren't paying. And we have to be careful about using that language.
but we will be eventually doing that. And I think it's more important to be transparent about it.
Agreed, but we raise rates for other reasons too. We don't want to give the impression that the only reason we're raising rates is because people are being treated unfairly.
Okay. Any other comments on this topic?
So we have a couple of things to provide based on committee direction. We'll get those together, and I think this is going to be coming to the board possibly for discussion as well. So when we do that, we'll bring those items forward.
And just to recap, I'll go ahead and send out that June 16th letter from the auditors to the full board. And then we'll make sure that we'll work on trying to get the postings of any of the attachments as early as possible when the posting of the the committee or the agenda is posted. Apologies. And then we'll try and see if we get you a list of customers. We'll go ahead and ask legal and circle back with you on that, Director Boyd Hodgins. And I think that's on my to-do list. That's about it. So unless I missed anything, let me know.
Great. Thank you. You guys put a lot of work into this and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Wes and his team. They did a great job. Thank you. Made my job easy just sitting here and saying next item.
Now it officially has been 2 hours you've been listening to me.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, just once again, well, phenomenal job all the way around. Thank you to our other presenters that we had this evening as well. And it was a very, I think, a very valuable Finance Committee meeting. For those that joined in the public, thanks for joining us. And we'll go ahead and adjourn. Everybody have a wonderful evening.